Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. We are about to begin the second session of the CIUHCT 2023 lectures. Today, we are honored to have the participation of Professor Amélia Polónia, whom I admire on a personal and a professional basis, from whom I have had and still have the immense pleasure and privilege of learning a lot. Much could be said in the brief presentation I'm going to make of Professor Amélia, who does indeed have an extensive and very respectable CV, with participation in various initiatives, projects, and coordination positions. But I'm going to stick to the formality and follow the short bio we received to introduce her. Amélia Polónia is a professor in the Department of History, Political and International Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Porto, and a researcher at CITCEM, Transdisciplinary Center of Culture, Space and Memory. Her research interests include the study of dynamics created by the action of informal and self-organized networks in the modern period, migration, knowledge transfer, globalization processes, informal mechanisms, and the reconstruction of overseas empires, and the role of human in colonization processes are key themes in her recent lines of research. Her publications on the subject include individually in curatorship, Beyond Empires, Global Self-Organizing Cross-Imperial Networks, 15th to 18th Century, published by Brill in 2016, co-edited with Katia Antunes, Female, the Alter Ego of Maritime Societies, Practices and Representations of Gender, Portugal, 16th Century, in Seaports in the First Global Age, Portuguese Agents, Networks and Interaction, 15th to 19th Century, edited by Amélia Polónia and Katia Antunes. Connection Words, Women as Intermediaries in the Portuguese Overseas Empire, in Cooperation and Empire, Local Realities of Global Processes, edited by Tenjal Buyer, published by Bragahan Books. Human and Gender in the Portuguese Overseas Empire, Society, Economy and Politics, 16th to 17th centuries, in Gendering the Portuguese-speaking world, edited by Francisco Bettencourt, published by Brill in 2021, in co-authorship with Rosa Capelão. She is the PI of the FLUP team for the project Minant, Prototyping a Nature and Culture Experience under the European program EIT Bauhaus called EIT Community New European Bauhaus. Her talk is entitled Woman as a Go-Betweens in Early Modern Process of Transference of Knowledge in Overseas Territories. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Professor Amélia. Let me just remind that we have 14 minutes or so for the presentation, followed by another 14 minutes for the discussion. The floor is yours. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Monique. I think you mentioned more than I have done, but anyway, thank you for this nice presentation. And I would obviously like to greet all the presents and thanks for this invitation to participate in CIUHCT Conferences 2023. And as I said before, informally, it's not the first time I cooperate with your research center, and it will be my pleasure that we can do it more often, since we are clearly some convergence between our research lines. I see I have already addressed specifically to Professor Isabel Amaral, who is now here present, and also as representative of the coordination of the CIUHCT, together with Professor Ana Duarte Rodrigues. And I would like also to address and thank Monique Palma and and Luís Tirapicos, co-organizers of the 2023 cycle of conferences. I thank particularly Monique because she was a kind of the middle way person, and he has the difficult task to pressure me to answer to the late requests, my late answers to the requests. I see in the screen many colleagues that I know very well. I'm not going to mention them by name. I think they will all know who I'm referring to. Thank you for your presence, and feel free if this lecture is going to be too long. I would like in any way to address particularly Darlene Abreu Ferreira, which I've seen not with the picture, a colleague that came from the University of Winnipeg, Canada, and is still expecting to see me in Lisbon, since by coincidence she was also here. And she was one of the reasons for me also to choose the English as an expression, a way of communication, because I would like her that is interested a lot by these issues related to women in Portugal, in Portuguese.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay,
Darlene.
hello. Okay, I'm trying to figure this out. Thank you, hello.
Hello. So you still exist, both of us. We don't see it for many, many years, but it is a pleasure having you here, and we certainly will meet in a while. So it is really for me a pleasure to be here, but I would like also to finish and to give a last note, precisely referring to my recent collaboration with Rosa Capelão, that she's been the co-author of many or some of my works on this subject. So she is co-responsible, and the acknowledgement of her contributions to what I'm going to present is obviously paramount and has to be duly recognized. As some of you that know me know that, first, I use written texts, and secondly, I speak too much. So I really appreciate if Monique or Luís call me attention if I'm going to be if I'm going too long, and please, before 10 minutes and then 5 minutes before the end of the conference call, my attention for it. So, according to the title and the abstract, this lecture focuses on women acting as intermediaries between worlds in the Portuguese colonial empire, specifically on medical marketplace and mostly in the Portuguese state of India. In this context, it will look at the roles of both European and autochthone women in the East, starting from the assumption that in the early modern period, processes of settlement and empire building, transference of knowledge and cultural translation depended at a great extent on the performances of these intermediaries. The focus on women as go-betweens aims at filling a gap in colonial studies. An overall social history of colonial empires is still sadly lacking, so that this paper can also be perceived as an attempt to shed light on the long ignored but crucial role of women as intermediaries between worlds. While there is some literature on the role of women in colonial wars, it tends to neglect indigenous women as social actors or their roles in creating new social and cultural patterns in colonial territories. This is even more conspicuous for the 15th and 16th century, the first and more decisive moments for the establishment of intercultural relations. The Portuguese overseas world is a case in point. This paper aims thus at filling this gap by analyzing the importance of both local and the Portuguese women acting within medical marketplaces in colonial spaces, understood as a historical stage in which cooperation, negotiation, assimilation, and confrontation patterns were inevitable. In the absence of new data, this lecture approaches old sources with new questions, aware of the fact that we are looking at those universes through the lens of colonial eyes. The data collected are European, mostly Portuguese official records such as chronicles, administrative correspondence, and letters of from missionaries. These are narratives presented by men which, even when ascribing to women a subordinated and peripheral position in their accounts, note and acknowledge their roles. Following other publications, this one focuses on the specific domain of women's in medical practices, as already said. Women are taken as holders of a practical knowledge crucial to the implementation of order, stability, and change in colonial or colonized societies. This analytical approach, combining the history of science and colonial studies in a post-colonial perspective, requires a previous reflection on the concept of knowledge, taken here in its broadened sense. We might understand knowledge as the information and the skills acquired by a person or a group of persons through experience or education, whether theoretical or practical, and aimed at interfering with a reality. According to this, knowledge building is connected with the action of mastering a science, an art, a method, or a procedure. In this sense, the concept of knowledge is much broader than the traditional concept of scientific knowledge, the later understood as a collection of verifiable facts supported by evidence collected by scientific theories and submitted to the application of what should be considered a scientific method. Accordingly, science would be taken as a knowledge obtained in a methodical way, verified and contrasted with reality, always referring to methods and concepts that are valued and accepted by the scientific community. According to this, scientific knowledge is understood as universal and aiming at identifying and verifying scientific norms, scientific laws, resulting themselves from a scientific method, all usually referred according to Western theories and methods. It means those arising from the alleged scientific revolution of the 17th century. This kind of knowledge is presented as being expressed through an objective and codified language, which allows its transmission within a universal setup. This rationale implies a linear and unidirectional way when considering circuits of transmission of knowledge on a global scale, as discussed in previous publications as well. The concept of knowledge applied in this paper is much broader than this and intentionally leaves behind the notion of scientific knowledge, the assumption that cultural traditions...
Desculpa interromper, mas os slides não estão avançando, não sei se...
Ainda não.
Ah, tá, desculpa.
Não, mas na verdade, pois não estão mesmo. Ok. Em todo o caso, eles não estão avançando...
ok.
Não, mas tem razão, é que eu estou a utilizar uma versão em que não tenho isso sinalizado, mas a verdade é que, sim, irão avançar daqui a nada.
Ok, tá ótimo. Desculpe, professora. Obrigada.
Nada. So I was saying that the concept that we are going to apply here is much broader than the scientific knowledge, and the assumption that cultural traditions and religious beliefs constitute the basis of different kind of knowledge is inherent to it. It relies on sort of knowledge shared and transmitted within a specific social and cultural environment, received by the ancestors or accumulated by experience. In this sense, knowledge is taken as not always objectifiable and universally communicable and shared, but rather guided by and directed to actions within a specific social environment, usually understood as traditional knowledge and local knowledge transmitted culturally within a defined geographical and cultural area, its spread and uses have, however, to be understood in a different global and intercultural setup when different worlds intermingle and collide. This is what happened in the first global age between 1500 and 1800, compelled by colonial dynamics. Intercultural dialogue is thus an inevitable outcome of such a wide transference of knowledge. It might apply both to different kinds of scientific, erudite, academic knowledge or to practical knowledge. Personal skills intervene in this knowledge production and uses. The analysis of our topic could be carried out under the prism of colonial history, the history of science, the cultural history of knowledge, or even under the focus of a gender history. This lecture combines some of these dimensions, trusting in a fruitful result. The history of science seeks to understand how knowledge was constructed, institutionalized, legitimated, transmitted, exploited, and capitalized. On the other hand, when departing from cultural history, a study of discourses, representations, and imaginaries is carried out, analyzing the practices and social strategies produced by the diverse and hierarchical forms of knowledge. As for colonial and post-colonial studies, the discussion highlights concepts such as Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, centers and peripheries, diffusionist theories, and more recently, the theories of cooperation, and those pointing to a polycentric local production and a global reconfiguration of knowledge, areas in which authors like Kapil Raj or Livingstone arise. As for gender history, this is not really the central focus of this paper here, as it sees women as agents of knowledge production on an equal footing with any other agent of history, without taking into account other variables that determine the construction of a gender identity. As social actors within their historical contexts in Asia, Africa, or Americas, the study of local agents' performances, men and women, becomes crucial, not only within the field of the history of science, but as holders of a professional and or traditional and practical knowledge acquired by social and generational transmission. Here we argue that that kind of wisdom would comprise over time and within our context, knowledge arising both from European and non-European cultural traditions. The focus of our study is thus the analysis of production, reproduction, and circulation of practical knowledge, and the circumstances in which the agents associated with it exercised it in a universe marked by cultural encounters comprising different border areas. Those spaces are understood as loci of production and transference of knowledge in which women had a determinant role, even if belonging or when belonging to different, sometimes opposite, sometimes belligerent cultures and religions. In the context in which they came into contact, different forms of knowledge interacted and different epistemes, including the European, the Asian, the African, or the American, intermingled, collided, or complemented each other. In the universe under observation, it is not so clear that the colonial discourse would be dominant or Western knowledge hegemonic. Instead of a hierarchy or a ranking of knowledge, our study points to a multiple influences circulating between different knowledge systems when in contact within specific historical contexts. It is thus understandable that as opposed to the diffusion and the dissemination models, which assume a unidirectional flow. In this paper, the transference and circulation of knowledge indicates circuits and flows that are by their nature open and multidirectional. Those include the possibility of mutations and reconfigurations, even at their points of origin. This perspective confers agency to all the protagonists involved in the interactive process of construction and reconfiguration of knowledge, since the circulation is, as we said already, not linear, nor does it occur in enclosed spaces. It is a process, a movement that occurs based on networks and channels, as it happens through exchange, imposition, and negotiation processes, locally and globally speaking. Within colonial dynamics, those movements are tendentially marked by asymmetries of power. However, although the asymmetry in the negotiation processes resides in power relations, being colonized does not imply a passive or subaltern role within the process. Power relations within colonial empires have been analyzed mostly within an institutional setup. Changing the focus to the commoners, the individual agents involved in the process, enables us to provide new insights into this phenomena, together with a new emphasis on the locus of knowledge production. The perception of the metropolis as a center and the colonial spaces as peripheries, understood as a single category, loses accuracy when replaced by the much more enriching concept of border zones or zones of contact, both in Asia, Africa, the Americas, or Europe. The process under scrutiny includes the acquisition of knowledge, the collection of materials used for its application, its transference and assimilation within the premises of the contact zone, its circulation, propagation, and potential ultimate acceptance in other places. This acceptance is contentious, though, and depends on criteria of authority within different spaces, together with the correspondence institutional setup, these being dependent on policies of education and knowledge transmission in each one of the spaces under analysis. As much as all those issues are challenging, this lecture will only focus on stages of knowledge building and transmission in colonial spaces involving the encounters between colonized and colonizers. As we said, and not always the power asymmetries implied by colonial processes equaled asymmetries in knowledge transmission. The role of the Brahmins in Goa, for instance, and the acknowledgement of their unavoidable contributions to knowledge building within the capital of the Portuguese state of India, Goa, is but an example. The nature and composition of the Jesuit boutiques, the pharmacies, is another. The content of the second part of this paper, if you arrive there and leave the theory, selectively focused on women as medical practitioners, will be, as we expect, yet another example of this. These encounters implied that different cultural forms, societies, spaces, usually understood as local or traditional, were reconstructed and transformed by the contact with new kinds of knowledge, new epistemes brought by the elites or by the commoners, whether locals or foreigners. These processes sometimes created a position between colonizers and colonized, between European and Asian, modern and traditional, sometimes contributed to the fabric of a syncretic knowledge and the transference of practices derived from the pure functioning of mechanisms of cooperation, taking into account the observable existence of regional differences. Nonetheless, and according to the state-of-the-art contributions, the analysis of any kind of science cannot be understood properly out of global context. A global history of knowledge is thus called for, which would, however, have to integrate the local and the regional as a focus. Peter Gallison, Trading Zones, and Marie-Louise Pratt's Contact Zones concepts emerge as useful to approach our topics, as do the collective book edited by Daniela Bleichmer and L.J. Wendt on the globalization of knowledge in the Iberian colonial world, in which some of the presents in this audience participated and contributed to. I'm not going to specify the contents of this book that many of you know already, and I'm going to move a little bit further, trying to enter in the topic, which I didn't, or I did only theoretically. So within this historiographical context, the need for more studies on the role of women as medical practitioners and holders of medical knowledge is justified and asks for added attention. Let's just mention that this last book that I mentioned is very important to recover the centrality of the Iberian contributions for knowledge production, but has one single chapter dedicated to women and specifically to women's medicine. So within this historiographical context, there is a need for more studies on the role of women as medical practitioners and holders of medical knowledge. At the universe under scrutiny in this title, in this proposal, is the Portuguese colonial world, with particular emphasis to the state of India. In that vast world, unified by a web of maritime connections and characterized by diverse models of settlement, the heterogeneity of the roles, the profiles, and the performances of women vary in a large scale, determined both by the strategy of the Portuguese settlers and by women's status on the economies, societies, and cultures of contact. This lecture departs from the assumption that women were not only the basis for the biological and social reproduction of colonial societies, they were agents of production, while economic partners essential to the building up and maintenance of colonial empires. Their role as intermediaries between worlds is indeed essential as key elements in marriage strategies or as political, economic, and cultural go-betweens. They thus become cultural mediators, intermediaries between different languages, cultures, technical and scientific knowledge. For our purpose, we will focus on the role of intermediaries only in the health marketplace, and even so only in some topics. Sorry. Okay. No wonder they appear in frequently in the Portuguese official and non-official sources as translators, as elements of communication between different worlds, mastering diverse languages and different cultural codes. Since European expansion and dominion depended on the knowledge on climate, geography, production and consumption markets, maritime circuits, language, cultures, trade products, trade hubs concerning worlds that were new to the European, information was the most valuable asset. Women were part of that chain of information transmission and crucial elements of networks in which acquaintance and kinship were consolidated patterns of cooperation. Those fluxes of information flow were not, however, unidirectional or unilateral, and the same women and men could be equally valuable in their native societies, communities, and families. We follow in this paper some basic understandings of the theories of cooperation, according to which cooperation is seen as a social processes where individuals, groups, and institutions act in a concerted way to reach common goals. I'm going to pass again. Maybe some of you know already my studies about cooperation, and I don't want to insist in the basis of these theories, but just stressing that we cannot apply the theories and mechanisms of cooperation without understanding two things in terms of colonial context. The first one is that the individual and the local attributes of the elements involved interfere in those models of cooperation. We cannot use them in an abstract way. And secondly, most of that cooperation was imposed, also in the case of the women that we are trying to study. But some other ways of cooperation were spontaneous. This seems particularly noticeable in health questions and medical knowledge. If some diseases were new to the Europeans, for instance, malaria, they would not know how to do with it, how to deal with it, and depended on local knowledge and therapeutics. Simultaneously, local herbs and medical treatments turned out to be very useful and began to enrich the missionaries, in particular the Jesuits, at least those that kept them better, boutiques, the pharmacies. On the other hand, European medicine could be perceived and was used as an alternate way of cure. It was even employed as a way of conversion, as a resource to provide successful means to call for and to integrate local population under Catholic rule. I could give and elaborate on the example of some letters that were sent in 15th century from the Kingdom of Congo, supposedly written by the African king, asking to send Portuguese physicians and surgeons to cure the souls. Obviously, that what was beyond that was the essay to replace the local healers and to replace those symbolic ways of healing and to replace the local gods by the Christian ones. So here clearly the Western medicine and the Portuguese medicine and the physicians and surgeons are used in order to, as a cultural model, to interfere and to replace the health authorities, let's say, in Africa. So in this sense, medical practices, scientific authority, as well as religious and political submission are elements of the same equation. But let's return to India. Let's return to the state of India. There is, well, we use, as I say, many letters of missionaries, and one of them is Father João dos Santos, a Dominican, that after forbidding the presence of any Portuguese, men or women, by the time of the festivities performed among Muslims, motivated by the act of circumcision and condemning the sociability between Portuguese and Muslim women, exchanging clothes and jewelry and participating in parties together, after all this kind of prohibition and calling them clearly infidels, is the one that says, as it is, I quote in this slide, referring to a woman, an honor from my great friend, brother of an old Moorish woman called Manasua, a great master who had healed me from the hair, very cautiously, of which I was very thankful. So what I'm stressing here is that the general opinion against the infidels and sociability of the infidels was clear in all his correspondence, except for this woman that was really a healer, and which he refers to a great consideration and the dignity. You are seeing the slides changing, are you?
Yes, sim, professor, sim.
Okay. Within cultural transferences of rituals and knowledge related to health practices, one deserves particular attention due to its significance to any woman, no matter the culture she belongs to, childbirth. In this respect, the successive diocesan councils of Goa plainly forbade from the very first in 1567 the presence of local non-Catholic midwives attending the delivery of Christian women, including, obviously, the converted, the spouses of the Portuguese casados, unless they had explicit permission from the bishop. The Fifth Ecclesiastical Council considered that an unfaithful Daya could help, but only if there was no Christian available and on the condition that two other Christian women were there as well, so as to perform baptism if needed and to prevent any superstitious practices. The same chapter heads that I quote, "No person will take a Gentile net nurse for raising their children under penalty of 50 perdaus, and if she is Moorish, besides the same penalty, will incur a great excommunication, since it is certain that the children take the customs of the people who raised them and continue with them once raised." By that time, the accumulated experience of the colonizers was most probably showing how acculturation works both ways, being in all probability more favorable to autochthone peoples and cultures. For different reasons, the same ecclesiastical deliberation forbade any Christian to be treated by non-Christians, physicians, or even to be shaved by an infidel. From this perspective, one can perceive that importance is given to certain healing practices, mostly focused on their possible symbolic meanings. Forbidding them is a way to impose their own vision of the world, the knowledge and the practitioners deriving from a certain religious and an intellectual background. This should inevitably condition the flows of knowledge sharing. What is known about exchanges in medical practices and pharmaceutical treatments shows, however, exactly the opposite. A persistent and intense transference of knowledge from Eastern to Western societies and a well-documented acknowledgement of the added value of Eastern and Far Eastern medical knowledge. The question remains, to what extent were there effective exchange of practices, techniques, and knowledge around, for instance, childbirth among Portuguese and local midwives? Mobility from Eastern and Far Eastern territories is in fact suggestive when focused on the activities of midwives. At the same time, Garcia Horta mentions Javanese midwives operating in India. Other sources identify Portuguese women carrying out the same occupation as in Goa. In Portugal, as in Europe, childbirth prevailed as a main marketplace for women acting in a medical role. Because of the requirement of an intimate contact with other women's bodies, and furthermore, the reproductive organs are also the sexual organs, and any physical contact is conditioned by a heteronormative cultural context. It is thus understandable that women would dominate empirical practices around the birth associated with the need for and the prestige of a still predominantly practical and generational knowledge surrounding childbirth. We all know that in Europe, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, an attempt of epistemic hegemony of medical academia took place, also in the area of obstetric knowledge, but until then, and even during this time, and even today in some societies, knowledge about childbirth was encompassed within a knowledge or a wisdom possessed by certain, usually female, experts. As to where they would gather that kind of knowledge in Europe or in colonial spaces, some answers can be provided in the East, and only as an example. Gaspar Correia, the Portuguese chronicler, mentions a woman, Ana Fernandes, performing as healer of the wounded in the First Dio siege in 1538. She's presented as gifted to heal with a technique using egg white. She was married to a bachelor in medicine. However, what we know about knowledge transmission in Portugal, and was already subject to a paper, presents further complex ways of medical knowledge transmission among women further than marriage. Learned tracks are included by the contact with professionals and doctors, together with a generational career from father or mother to daughter, and self-research and learning. All are identified as capable of providing women with innovative ways of willing, not only the marriage, not only the transmission from father to daughter. There are other areas in which women are increasingly associated with, both in Portugal and the East, and that are those connected with bodily hygiene and the practice of cleaning the colon with a bath of warm water. Women who use that methods are called cristaleiras, from the Portuguese word clister, used to identify the method. Their presence is acknowledged in the East. In the sources, one might assume that they are Portuguese women, the cristaleiras, suggesting that kind of practices as brought from the West. It is in fact totally in keeping with the Galenic procedures and healing philosophy performed mostly by purges and bleeds to extract the bad humors. We can also find similar practices described on the work of the adventurous Fernão Mendes Pinto, the Peregrinação, inspired on the experiences lived in the East and Far East in the middle of the 16th century. When describing China, he mentions women as cristaleiras, who administered intestine bleeds, side by side with men who heal sores, bobas, syphilis, and give suadouros, sweatings. The author does not despite mentioning old women who served as midwives and give medicines to pregnancies and, I quote, to give birth and not to give birth. The author, we are talking about obviously practices of abortion. The author presents himself as a protagonist of curative practices using local woods, which liquid cures diseases, or employing a technique of suturing wounds, as he sometimes saw how to do it in India, and I was quoting now. Keeping our focus on colonial spaces, other medical and healing practices performed by women deserve further main attention, as those involving sexual diseases, just like we can read in this extensive quotation. So here what happens is that the author, Frei João dos Santos, again, he gives evidence of some women, slaves on the east of Africa, that used to take some kind of medicine based obviously on herbs to provoke abortions from Portuguese men and the intercourse with Portuguese men, and then this clearly an elaboration of the mind of these ecclesiastic agents. They would be very sick, the women, the slaves, and in order to survive, they had to have intercourse again with a man to whom they would pass this kind of disease, unless they would be able to give them a kind of a counter medicine in order to cure them. Obviously, we have here all the negative concepts imposed to women, and women as sexual objects, and women as sexual demons that would kill the men by with their intercourse. So the inherent power of these women, even as slaves, and the degree of dependence of the Portuguese on them in order to guarantee their own survival is plainly established in this quotation. Africa is, in this domain, an inexhaustible terrain of research, as we find there the thin line between medicine and sorcery, transforming these women into frequent targets of inquisitorial inquiries and convictions. And when we think about slavery and slave trade, and namely the transatlantic, but not only, because obviously the Indian Ocean is another space now privileged for study of the slave circulation, slave flow, slave trade. So we can understand how this kind of knowledge and this kind of superstitions, as understood by the Inquisition, was spread to the Indian Ocean and also to the Americas. So the inherent power of these women is clear, and it is why then that were also targeted by repeated and frequent inquisitorial inquiries and convictions. This topic leads us to another challenging.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we can have around 8 minutes or so to leave some time for discussion. So,
okay, perfect. So I'm going to speed up and maybe give up my text and trying to base on my slides and speed up a little bit. So in the same tone, and I think it is understandable that I wanted to spend some time with the kind of theoretical and conceptualization of the kind of knowledge that we are dealing with in order to understand that this is really a knowledge for survival, and clearly practical knowledge. So let's focus now in another domain that we mentioned already, the practices of abortion. There are repeated references, in this case by Pedro Teixeira, that mention and explain and give the characteristics of some herbs that are taken and are given in the East, also to Portuguese women, sometimes to expel dead fetus from the belly, but they can, as it is suggested, also be used, and they are, as abortive practices. And there are several examples of these. Then we have another dimension, which is not, this one is not necessarily or explicitly connected with abortions, but it has to do as the way some herbs and some plants are used by the European, by the Portuguese. And in this case, we have a quotation from the Colóquio dos Símbolos e Drogas e Coisas Medicinais da Índia, de Garcia de Horta, that is focused in the Galanga from Java, and he describes it with detail, but not only that, he clearly demonstrates that the classics, the Arabs and the Greeks, the Greek medicines didn't know that kind of plant. So the Portuguese, in this case, physicians were clearly in a better position because they were the first, obviously, in the Western world to know this kind of plants and their medical uses. Why do I quote here Garcia de Horta when I'm talking about women? Garcia de Horta uses his own slave, Antonia, in order to give credit to what he is explaining. As we know, Colóquios dos Simples is written, is a dialogue between Juano and Horta, and when Juano questions the wisdom of Horta in what refers to local wisdom, he calls Antonia his slave in order to give trust and give trust to what he's saying. The same thing is said, and now directly connected with the previous topic, the abortion practices, by Cristóvão da Costa, who calls and refers of the carambolas and their uses. And as it is in green said, I saw a midwife or comadre, which they call daia, using this dried powder fruit with leaves of betel to expel the after the birth, and the dead creature that was in the womb. And then he clearly suggested that it is also used to finish, sorry, it is not yet the end of it, but we'll arrive there. Okay, so what I had more, but I think we are going to stop a little bit here, but it is other testimonies of practices of abortions to which Portuguese and Iberian women would contact, namely in Latin America, and some of them were clearly a narrative from the Aztecs elites. So, and mostly there are ecclesiastic registers of that kind of occurrences and the way women use them to avoid pregnancies, but also to in some instances be available all the year, all the time to the emperor or to their own husbands. So we are mentioning here the state of India, but maybe a great deal of what we are saying about this transference of knowledge, and even obviously any kind of curative practices that come from Africa to Americas through the slaves, women, are other kind of examples that we can we could bring together. Also in the MENA region, there are clearly assumptions from missionaries that they should replace the white elements in the crews of the Portuguese boats by black, because first they were always sick, because they were not strong enough, and because since they had frequent intercourse with the African women, they would practice systematically abortions. And the proof was, according to this missionary, that there is no mulattoes in this region, and after seeing those women, many of them pregnant. So there are really several examples, and so obviously they should call the attention of that kind of practices, and they describe in detail where those herbs come from and which are those practices. So I ask your attention for just 2 minutes to finish 2 paragraphs, to which I will finish this lecture. So, overseas territories were indeed a privileged space for the production, transformation and circulation of knowledge among European, African, Asian, and American medical practitioners, including women, performing as healers and taking care of male and female bodies, requiring all the help and the treatment available, no matter which of the cultural spheres they belonged to. Those women were themselves circulating encyclopedias of practical knowledge. The sharing of this knowledge would be inevitable and certainly reproductive for the reconfiguration of knowledge. Innovative knowledge might emerge even if resting on the most telluric of bases, which, however, was not necessarily always the case. Innovation might, in any case, arise where practitioners of such diverse traditional and practical knowledge encountered each other. Summing up, different episodes of intercultural contacts and within the scope of Portuguese overseas colonial settlements and influence show that some of these women, Portuguese and autochthone alike, came into play in several domains, including the one involving medical practices. They were holders of a kind of useful knowledge oriented to problem solving. Among other techniques and methods of cure, they dominated conception, abortion, childbirth, sexual diseases were the target of our analysis today. By the use of different plants and the control of some techniques, women showed capacity of adaptation, presenting themselves as intermediaries between worlds in motion. And now, yes, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, that's it.